Hello and welcome to the Daily Space. My name is Annie Wilson, and most weekdays, the CosmoQuest team is here putting science into your brain. Today, however, is for Rocket Roundup. Let's get to it, shall we? So first up this week, on March 11th at 8:13 UTC, SpaceX's Falcon 9 booster 1058 launched the L-20 mission, putting another 60 Starlink satellites to orbit from Slick 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. As you'll see from this video, the launch took place in the middle of the night.
Stage one.
T-minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition and liftoff.
Stage one propulsion
Pupils
on.
pitching downrange.
For those of you keeping score at home, this was the 6th mission for this booster, and one of the fairings had flown on 2 previous missions, while the other fairing had only previously flown once. Booster 1058 successfully landed on the barge, just read the instructions, which was stationed 663 kilometers downrange. The fairings were recovered from the water by Go Searcher and Go Quest recovery ships, and we're able to show you the landing on the barge.
Stage one landing leg deploy.
All right, and there you can see we've landed first stage on our drone ship. Just read the instructions. This marks our 76th recovery of an orbital class rocket and the 6th recovery for this particular booster.
About 9 hours later, that same day at 1751 UTC, a Long March 7 Alpha successfully launched the Shiyan 9 satellite from Wencheng Spacecraft Launch Center, which is on the island of Hainan along the southern coast of China. This marked the second launch of a Long March 7 Alpha. According to Chinese media, the satellite is for in-orbit verification tests of new technologies such as space environmental monitoring. Put another way, just like NASA, China sometimes launches payloads just to see if a new toy will work, and in this case, the new toys will monitor the conditions in space around the satellite. Let's take a look at the launch. This was the second launch and first successful launch of this new rocket configuration. Around the time of the launch, information about the previous launch failure was released. After a very quick but very thorough fault tree investigation of just 20 days, Chinese engineers determined the cause of the failure was cavitation in the booster tank. Cavitation is a fancy way of saying that the fuel had bubbles in the mix, and these changed how the fuel burned. In this case, it was not in a good way. Those bubbles prevented the usual amount of fuel from reaching the engine. Less fuel means lower thrust. Unfortunately, that lower thrust couldn't be compensated for by the upper stages of the rocket, and it ultimately failed to reach orbit. The investigation was followed by numerous tests conducted over the next 3 months to come up with a fix for the problem. Exactly 7 months after the initial failure, the fix was proven successful by this launch of the Long March 7 Alpha. Next up, on March 13th at 2:19 UTC, the Yaogan 31-4 mission took off atop a Long March 4 Charlie rocket from the Qiuquan Satellite Launch Center in northwestern China. This was the fourth trio of Yaogan 31 satellites launched for this constellation, with the first three batches going up on April 10th, 2018, and earlier this year on January 29th and February 24th. Yaogan translates to remote sensing, so it makes sense that the Chinese Academy of Space Technology stated after one of the previous launches that the satellites will be mainly used to carry out electromagnetic environmental detection and related technical tests. The successful launch was announced with few words and this launch video. Finally, on March 14th at 11:01 UTC, a SpaceX Falcon 9 lofted another 60 Starlink satellites to orbit for the Starlink L-21 mission from LC-39 at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This was the 9th mission of Booster 1051, a new record for SpaceX. Like the other Starlink launch, the fairings had both previously flown, in this case on the Transporter 1 mission back in January of this year. All 60 satellites were deployed into orbit successfully. Booster 1051 successfully made its 9th landing on the barge, Of Course I Still Love You. Both fairings were recovered from the water by Go Searcher and Go Quest. To accommodate the rapid launch cadence, the Go twins dropped off the fairings from the previous flight, L-20, in a port in North Carolina, so it could head back out to the landing zone for L-21. Another ship transported L-20's fairings from North Carolina back to the Cape. After recovering L-21's fairings, Go Searcher and Go Quest headed directly to Port Canaveral after recovering the fairings, arriving before Of Course I Still Love You and Booster 1051 in the afternoon of March 16th. We have a photo of this event thanks to Dr. WD40, who went out to stream the return in Florida. Thanks for letting us use this image. By our team's tally, 1,263 Starlink version 1.0 satellites have been deployed so far, which is approximately 88% of the first phase. 3 more Starlink launches, or 180 satellites, should complete the first constellation. Sorry, it should complete the first shell of the constellation. The constellation overall is going to be huge. There are several phases. With the current rate of launches, the CosmoQuest team expects this to happen as soon as April or May of this year. But because space is hard, it might mean June. We would add one caveat. A certain number of Starlinks fail for various reasons, so an additional launch may be needed to top numbers off. Because the satellites have finite and relatively short lifespans, it will be necessary to periodically add new satellites to the constellation as older ones are decommissioned. For us, this means more launches like this to watch.
T-minus 15 seconds.
Falcon 9 is configured for flight.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition and liftoff.
Vehicles pitching downrange.
After a quick break, we'll be back to look at how astronauts take out the trash. Don't go away. Welcome back. Most of the time, when the International Space Station needs to get rid of trash, the crew just stuff unneeded items into a used cargo capsule. When it gets full, they drop it into the atmosphere where the capsule burns up. At least, this is what usually happens. Just like how garbage trucks occasionally leave items behind, the astronauts sometimes have waste that is too big to go in that outbound cargo craft turned trash can. For the International Space Station, Thursday, March 11th, was the big garbage day. A 3-ton pallet of old nickel hydrogen batteries had been hanging around unused on the outside of the station, and the time to finally throw them out had come. These batteries had provided the station with power, but like all batteries, the day came when they needed to be replaced. They got set aside rather than thrown out because, well, 3 tons of batteries is a bit big for most of the cargo vehicles. Astronauts using the ISS's Canadarm released the pallet of old batteries from the side of the station and sent it on its way. These discarded batteries are the largest object ever jettisoned from the space station. The pallet is expected to re-enter the atmosphere in a few years. Until then, it will be yet another object for new fleets of low-orbiting commercial spacecraft such as CubeSats and SpaceX's Starlinks to maneuver around as they raise themselves into their operational orbits. In general, this is not how batteries should be disposed of. For the longest time, astronauts had done exactly what so many of us do. They kept the dead batteries hanging around in a box, or in their case, on a pallet. This unceremonious jettison was necessary because a Japanese HTV spacecraft that could have brought the batteries down in a controlled destructive reentry was unavailable. The ascent abort of Soyuz MS-10 in 2018 caused a ripple effect that delayed the schedule for replacing the old nickel batteries with new lithium-ion batteries. This resulted in one of the HTV spacecraft returning empty, leaving an extra set of old batteries on the station. Prior to this pallet of old batteries, the largest thing that had ever been released from the ISS was a 635 kilogram tank of ammonia from a temporary ISS cooling system that was released during a spacewalk in 2007. While this jettison does make life more complex for other spacecraft for the next few years, this does have the same eventual outcome that an HTV spacecraft would have allowed. The batteries will burn up in the upper atmosphere where it can't affect life or pollute our world. Do not try this method of battery disposal unless you are in space. I repeat, do not try this method of battery disposal unless you are in space. After the break, we're going to take a look at This Week in History. Stay tuned. Welcome back. This week in rocket history, we have another, historic mission, as well as the birth date of an important astronaut. On March 16th, 1966, at 1500 hours UTC, an uncrewed Atlas Agena was launched from Cape Canaveral in Florida with the Gemini Agena target vehicle, also known as GATV. It was followed 101 minutes later by a Titan II Gemini launch vehicle, a specialized version of the Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott on board Gemini 8. Gemini 8 chased down the Agena and performed 9 different maneuvers over a period of 6 hours, eventually bringing it to within 45 meters of the uncrewed Agena. After another hour of tests and inspections, the astronauts performed their final maneuver and completed the first ever docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. The original mission was to perform 4 different dockings and multiple tests that included a spacewalk. But 27 minutes after the first docking, both crafts started unexpectedly tumbling on all axes. The astronauts suspected the issue might be coming from the Agena, so Scott disengaged the capsule from the GATV, and Armstrong maneuvered the Gemini away from the Agena, but they were still spinning, and it was getting worse. This indicated that the issue must have come from the Gemini itself. As Gemini 8 tumbled at speeds exceeding 1 revolution per second, the astronauts were close to blacking out and didn't have a lot of time to react. They quickly deactivated the automated maneuvering system and attempted to counteract their violent motion of the spacecraft using their re-entry reaction control system's thrusters, eventually managing to stop the roll and stabilize the spacecraft. Safety protocols for the mission dictated that once the re-entry reaction control system's thrusters were engaged, the crew had to end the mission and come back to Earth immediately. This meant that any further tests and the planned spacewalk were canceled. After another orbit, the capsule fired its retro rockets and deorbited into the Pacific Ocean. United States Air Force frogmen parachuted out of a C-54 near the splashdown site to put flotation devices around the capsule and make sure the astronauts were safe until they were picked up by the USS Mason some 3 hours later. Post-flight investigations determined that the unexpected roll was caused by one of the roll thrusters firing continuously, but the investigation could not determine what caused the thruster to begin firing in the first place. It did, however, prompt NASA to add a dedicated kill switch for each element of the capsule in follow-up missions. Neil Armstrong would go on to command the first crewed lunar landing, Apollo 11. David Scott made it to the lunar surface as well, commanding Apollo 15 and driving the first lunar roving vehicle. March 16th also marks the birth date of Vladimir Komarov. Born in 1927, he was selected as part of the first group of Soviet cosmonauts in 1960, but a heart condition prevented him from being cleared to fly into space until Vashad 1 in October 1964. Vashad's one goal: to fly a 3-person crew in a capsule before the Americans could. The Vashad used the same basic spacecraft as the single-person Vashtook, so it was a tight fit with the 3 crew members. To make room in the craft, the backup deorbit motor was removed and the cosmonauts went without pressure suits. During their time in space, the crew was able to learn how to perform operations in a multiple crew spacecraft, observed the Earth from orbit, and recorded how the human body responded to weightlessness. The crew returned to Earth after 1 day in orbit. Komarov's other mission was Soyuz 1, the first crewed flight of the Soyuz spacecraft. Unlike the nearly flawless mission of Vashad 1, this mission was plagued by failures from the beginning. The first launch attempt aborted. Another launch attempt was made, and this time Soyuz 1 left the pad. Great news, right? Not so much. As soon as the spacecraft separated from the rocket, the problems began. Only one of the solar panels deployed, which left the craft with less power than it would normally receive. The radio failed, so communication with the ground was intermittent. The horizon sensor also failed, so Komarov couldn't determine his spacecraft's attitude for burns. Ground control, understandably, decided to end the mission early. The automatic system for deorbiting was triggered on the 16th orbit. Yeah, it failed too. Komarov manually performed the deorbit burn 2 orbits later. Thankfully, re-entry was normal and the drogue chute deployed. The main chute, however, failed to deploy because it was tangled. So the reserve chute deployed. That ended up getting tangled with the drogue chute. Without any parachutes, Soyuz 1 was unable to slow down enough for a safe re-entry. It impacted the ground at speed, destroying the spacecraft and killing Komarov. His remains were recovered, and he was given a state funeral in the Kremlin Wall necropolis in Moscow. After his death, he was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest award in the country for bravery. A bust of Komarov on a pillar was erected at the site of the crash as a memorial. After this break, we'll be back with stats. To wrap things up, here's a running tally of a few spaceflight statistics for the current year. We think there's 5 toilets in space, 3 installed on the ISS, 1 on the Crew Dragon, and 1 on the Soyuz. We're not sure if there's still a total of 3 toilets installed on the ISS, and we're looking into getting an official number. There have been 22 orbital launch attempts so far this year, including 1 failure. 548 satellites have been put into orbit from those launches, with just over 2/3 of those being Starlinks. I keep track of orbital launches by where they launched from, also known as spaceport. Here's that breakdown. USA 10, China 7, Kazakhstan 2, India 1, New Zealand 1, Russia 1. And for our fact of the week, last week I told you about a couple of people whose ashes had flown into space. This week I want to tell you about a piece of an apple tree that flew on the space shuttle to the International Space Station. As part of the celebrations for the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society, of which Isaac Newton was a former president, NASA astronaut Piers Sellers brought a fragment of the apple tree that inspired Newton's discovery of gravity in 1666 with him when he flew on the STS-132, the very last flight of the shuttle Atlantis to the International Space Station. Though the tree still stands at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, where Newton lived, pieces of it were stored in the Royal Society's vaults in the 1700s, along with a lot of other Newton memorabilia. The piece of the Isaac Newton's apple tree that went with Sellers was about 10 centimeters long and even had a little marking from the 17th century that read, "I, Newton." No one knows if this was inscribed by Sir Isaac himself. According to an article in The Guardian that appeared shortly after the 12-day mission in May 2010, Sellers said that he will take it up and let it float around for a bit, which will confuse Isaac. He went on to say, while it's up there, it will be experiencing no gravity. So if it had an apple on it, the apple wouldn't fall. Sir Isaac would have loved to see this, assuming he wasn't space sick, as it would have proved his first law of motion to be correct. And where is it today? At the time, this was 2010, Martin Rees, the then president of the Royal Society, stated that upon their return, the piece of tree and picture of Newton will form part of the History of the Royal Society exhibition that the Society will be holding later this year and will then be held as a permanent exhibit at the Society. Excuse me. This has been the Daily Space. Tomorrow, Pamela and Beth will be back with more science from the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference.